Hello, hello. Welcome to cEDH Metagame. I'm Tim, and tonight I'm joined by my friend James. Say hi, Squirrelmob.
Hello, everybody.
And Matt. Say hi, Matt. Hey, Cricket.
Hey, everybody.
So it is June, but last week in May, Mr. Squirrelmob released the latest update to the cEDH Metagame project for the month of May. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to do a quick little video going over it a little bit, just kind of seeing what the trends are like, at least from the submitted games. And, and then maybe have a little chat too. So, James, why don't you take it away and tell us what's going on with the project?
So, project had another month with a kind of middling number of games submitted, only about 78 or so. So not a ton, but still getting some good information. This month actually had a lot of not the top most submitted decks submitted. So we saw a little bit more diversity in what was submitted in this month's games.
Nice.
And that's pretty good. But a lot of the trends stay in pretty similar. We're seeing player one still has that big advantage. The other players are all around, like player four is at 20%, player three is at about 21%, player two is at about 23%, and then player one's at 35%. So,
okay.
Still seeing that benefit for who's going first. Speed of the games is really similar. With win cons, still a lot of the same there as well. So decks with the commanders.
So in case somebody hasn't watched the other three videos, what is that turn order? What are the win cons?
Sure, absolutely. So with the turn order, one of the things Project tracks is who wins what game that's submitted.
Okay.
And part of that is what seat that player is sitting in.
Okay.
So player one is the player who goes first.
Yep.
Two is second, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've seen consistently for the whole year plus that this has been running is that the player going first has an advantage. Typically, we would expect that each player in a perfect world would win roughly 25% of the time, give or take a little bit, right? Because there's variance, there's all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
But we've consistently seen player one winning more than 30%. And recently it's been in the 35 to 36% range, which is a lot higher than it should be.
Maybe that's why when I knew that I was in seat one, I picked Niv Mizzet, which marketably is a slower deck.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of strategy that goes into that, really, is if you know in advance what seat you're going to be in. So like with the MLC that Timmy and I are both participating in, you can pick your deck based on that and have a little bit different success with it, which is not to say that being in the first seat guarantees you'll win. In fact, I don't know about last week's games because I wasn't able to watch them, but prior to that, basically each week there's been only one, maybe two people who've won from the first seat. I can only think of three games off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. Timmy won once going first. I won once going first. And LJ from Reflecting Pool won once going first.
Yep.
And that was with three very different styles of decks. Timmy won with a hard control deck with Niv Mizzet. I won with Yuriko Turbonauz. My thinking on that was, if I'm playing a deck where my card advantage engine requires getting dudes into the red zone, having that extra turn means I'm attacking faster, and people probably won't have blockers.
Right.
And LJ won with Belby Stacks, which I think the consideration there is probably pretty similar to my thought line, which was Belby takes advantage of dealing combat to different people, or dealing combat damage to different people, so you want to be attacking sooner. Granted, all of LJ's decks kind of do that. He probably could have picked anything and been fine.
Right. I mean, he's got
that stable of just attack, turn him sideways.
Well, that's LJ, man. Well, and
I know, right?
That was kind of my same thing with Niv. It was like, I know Niv isn't the fastest to get down, but guaranteed being in front of everybody will give me an edge to get him down faster. So like if I can get Niv down on turn 3, I'm getting Niv down on my turn 3, but everybody else's is still at turn 2 trying to develop per se.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, most people, when they sit down for a game, have no idea if they're going to be first or not, because usually you determine by a die roll. Now, if you roll the die before you choose your deck, that can impact your choice.
That is
right. A deck with Dockside might be able to recover faster going later in the turn order than, say, a deck where you are really dependent on getting creatures into the red zone.
Dork base ramp, yeah.
Yeah.
And someday here, we're going to do a metagame project video on the MCL, right?
Yeah. At the end of the regular season, we'll have information on all the games from the MLC, and we'll be able to take a look at how it is similar or different than what we saw, because there's some structural differences, for example, knowing where you're going to sit before the game starts, that really change things.
And like the deck selection and limiting how many times you can play them and stuff. Yeah, that all plays a factor.
So it'll be interesting to see what's the same and what's different. But I haven't even looked at those numbers yet, because we're in most people's week 4 now.
Yeah, we're in, yeah. You and I are in week 5, but everybody else is week 4.
Right.
So, all right.
Yeah, and with speed of the game, we're just looking at what turn games end on. And so we've seen a trend towards sort of this faster, the slower end of the faster turns and the faster end of the mid-range turns, where a lot of the concentration of games ending is. So turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. Yeah. Those seem to be where the concentration of games ending is.
Yeah, and then pretty much after turn 6, it drops down pretty dramatically.
Just falls off the face of the earth.
Yeah.
So if we think about sort of the critical turn of a deck, when you want to be able to start setting up the things that make it so that you can do your thing, not necessarily running away with the game yet or being able to win, but being able to do whatever you need to do to get to that point, you've got to be able to do it by turn 2. That's realistically where we're at.
And then what about the win con?
Yeah, so the win cons, the big thing that's been going on is kind of 2 things are pacing the field. The first one is combos that kind of center around the commander. There's a couple reasons why that's the most submitted. It's a very broad category. It includes things like Gitrog and Elsha, both because, even though they do very different things as decks, they both need their commander to function and to win. And that is taking up about a little less than a third of the submitted games that submitted what the win con was are due to the commander in some way. The other one, which probably will shock no one, at about 21% is Oracle Console, which it's compact, 2-card win con in
blue-black,
a very strong color combination.
Yeah.
Not surprising there either.
Right.
What is a little surprising, and this might just be because of the way that these are categorized, is the number of win cons that directly involve Dockside. Now, that's not to say that Dockside isn't used to set up some of these other win cons and just isn't mentioned in people's answers, because it probably is.
Yeah.
But only 14 games out of 576 that answered this question mentioned Dockside at all.
Well,
and normally that's with Emil or Baron or whatever.
Right, even Teamer Sabretooth, because, I'll play it in Thar to make infinite mana sometimes.
It turns out it's pretty good at that.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised that there's 40 games in this report that have been won by combat damage.
Yeah.
Or 96 games. Wow.
Yeah, combat damage has been a big deal. Because it turns out that turning dudes sideways can get there.
That is slightly more wins than Breach is listed. Not that Breach probably isn't.
Yeah.
Probably most people just consider the consult the win and then the breaches to get to it. But
what's interesting, at least with all the spoilers that have been coming out, it seems like Breach is going to get a much bigger focus, because there have been some red cards that help support it more than help support Oracle Console. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of changes come from that. And then I also wonder how many of the infinite mana wins were Dockside wins, and they just didn't mention Dockside.
And that's a really fair question. I think a number of them did mention Dockside. So I think probably about 13 of those 14 Dockside games are also infinite mana wins because things can be dual categorized because it's the best way to do things, I suppose, or the easiest way to do things.
You're always striking that balance between like collecting data and then
and making it usable and how, making it submittable. Right.
Yeah.
But I'm sure some of the others are as well. A number of them were Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal.
Mm-hmm.
A handful of them were other various things. Like there's a couple that were freed from the reel.
Right.
The other thing is with combat damage, I think with the popular perception, which I don't know is entirely accurate, but the popular perception that Adnaz is the best category of deck right now, that Turbo Naz decks are what you want to be doing.
It's definitely the deck to beat.
Yeah. Combat damage becomes much more valuable against those decks, right? Mm-hmm. Even chipping in for 1 or 2 at a time, that is potentially 1 to 3 cards you're taking somebody off of with their Adnaz.
Or their Tymna draws.
You've got Tymna draws that work. You've got other things. In my last MLC game, won because of combat damage too. Killed 3 players with Ishai. Sometimes you just have a beater and people don't have a ton of answers to it. Which I think there's an argument to be made that maybe, just maybe, there ought to be a little more removal that people use. And this isn't based entirely on things like Ishai existing and just beating people down, but also like think about Hull Breacher. Think about Opposition Agent. Like those are some cards that can really warp a game around them, and they're fragile, but there's not a lot of people running really hard removal that gets rid of them.
I mean, I'll be honest. In the decks that are applicable, I am, in addition to like the bounce spells, which is the most common form of removal, and the blue, like the sands green Turbo Nuzlocke, but like in my decks that have green and black in them, I'm obviously running Abrupt Decay and Astrophy, but I've also been packing like either like Pongify, if it's just like Bug, if there's white swords. Like, so I've been upping and even putting in some sweepers. Like all my MCL decks that are, well, I have 2 MCL decks that are tech as control decks, Opus Thief and Niv. And I added sweepers and more spot removal to both of them.
Mm-hmm. I think that 1 mana removal is really important right now too, because Assassin's Trophy and Abrupt Decay are both incredibly powerful cards, but they're both 2 mana in 2 different colors.
Yeah,
that's a lot harder to keep up all the time than like a white for a swords or a blue for a Pongify or the new one, Suspend in MH2. I kind of like that card. It's very interesting.
It's funny that you do bring that up, though, because I'm seeing it a lot on the Grixis server, where most people have pretty much cut all forms of creature removal. All they're focused on are their bounces, which they primarily use for Dockside more than anything else.
Yeah.
And they've even gone so far as to cut like Deluge. So they literally have no sweepers. They've got bounce spells, but they most of the time will save them for Dockside, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's really where people are trying to strike that balance between how do I go fast versus how get cheesed out by this Hull Breacher.
Well, so like that's kind of my thing. So like maybe like 3, 4, even 5 months ago, that's what I was doing, was I was cutting all of that and putting in the bounce spells for the Dockside. But I have been finding that like most of the decks I play, I'm not the fastest deck in the pod. Like, remember when we were doing the Kess video, we were kind of talking about Kess and how I was like, I think Kess is better in a mid-range shell or like a control shell. And that's been my migration back to playing more spot removal, more AoE, more sweepers. Not like, overloading on it, but like probably in Kess, I'm probably running Psych Rift, Pyroclasm, and Toxic Deluge, or some amalgamation of those. You know what I mean? So I think that maybe the meta will progress back that way over as like if we were to timestamp this and then go back 3 months from now, maybe even slightly longer, like we'll see that trend will kind of take up. You know, just like I've been noticing, and like you pointed out, that the faster wins are starting to kind of drift out a little bit into the later early turns. So like instead of it being like 2 through 4, like 2, 3, and 4 are all the wins, it's now 3, 4, 5. And then I think that, you know, as it hits like maybe 4, 5, 6, we'll start to see it kind of start to shift back.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, and I mean, even looking at like the types of decks that are submitting and what rates they're winning at, you know, kind of the unsurprising thing here, at least to me that's unsurprising, is decks that kind of fall into different categories. Most of them win somewhere around a 25% clip, right? Not necessarily individual decks, but like if we take all the decks that are breach decks and put them together, or we take all the decks that are decks that rely on their commander and put them together. Almost all of these larger categories are falling within the range of what we would expect to see.
Yeah.
Especially the ones that are the most popular, right? So breach decks are incredibly popular. They're right around that 25% win rate.
Right.
Commander-centric decks, right around that 25% win rate. Nas decks, right around that 25% win rate. Now, some of that might be due to people experimenting with different brews, right? Because that takes into account like everything from the established blue farm all the way down to, you know, little Bobby Joe's, you know, Rog Tevesh deck that they're taking out for a spin for the first time that they've, you know, never tried before. But I think that kind of speaks to how if you give enough time and enough iterations of these things, it's probably going to work out in the end to kind of come out to that relatively level playing field.
Right. Mm-hmm. And have you noticed any trends like shifting in like what are the decks submitted? Like, are you getting different, like, I know for a while there you were getting a lot of Teshar submitted.
Yeah, that was in a previous version of the survey. This one still, like, Elsha has the most submissions overall, but they've kind of cooled off in the past couple months. This month, I think the most submissions came from, I think it was Urza Polytyrant, which is probably a little oversampled in this overall survey. But Gitrog had a number of submissions this time. A handful of other decks had quite a few. Yeah. So some had a bunch, some had very few. And with only, 78 games or whatever it was submitted, we're going to kind of run into that where it's going to be different from month to month.
That's not a ton, but I mean, that's still like, that's still 80 games. Like that's,
it's some, it's not perfect.
That's a big event. Like that's essentially equivalent to a moderate size FNM.
Mm-hmm.
Like for a comparison, because like most FNMs at like an LGS, like they'll probably have like, 20, 25 players at it. And they'll play like 3 rounds, 4 rounds, and you'll get about 80 games out of it. You know what I mean?
Right. Because I mean, if we take this whole thing, we're up to 690 games overall. So that's a Command Fest day or something like that.
I mean, it's not like the end all be all, but it's a thing. It's something. Just to kind of put it in a little perspective. Yeah. I was going to say, and I did notice from the trend is like, it looks like we've got mostly the usual suspects: Elsha, Timna Krom, Farm, Najila, Urza, Kess, Threat, CST variants, Roger Silas variants. Krom Sakashima is actually a little surprising. It's good, but it's a little surprising. Gitrog, Godo, and Kinnan.
I think the crux of Sakashima really comes down to Ken from Stacked EDH. Really was pretty diligent about submitting his games. And I think that's what it comes down to, right? It says because it's crowdfunded data, or crowdsourced, not crowdfunded, but crowdsourced data, it's going to come down to who's actually taking the time to do it.
Right. So if you want to submit, we're going to put the link to the forum in the show notes and submit your games, guys, because the more games we get, the better this data will be. And the more diverse of games that are submitted, the better the data will be. Like, it's only going to be as, like, the limiting factor is the user submission, essentially.
Yep.
You know? So, Cricket, did you notice anything, like, was there anything of note for you of the report or anything you wanted to kind of say about it?
So Grixis is my thing.
Yeah.
And so what is markedly missing from here, which I find quite surprising, is the lack of Tevish Crom. Like, I would have expected that, because that's the hype right now, is Tevish and Crom. And the fact that it hasn't seen more games, or at least hasn't had more reported seen games, is surprising.
So,
yeah, I think there's some piece of this with the survey that it lags a little bit in terms of the new hotness. Because I agree. I've seen a lot of people talking about Tevish Crom and even Armix Crom as kind of these two new Grixis core decks that people are exploring. Because for a while, people were really hot on Rog Silas, right? Because the idea was go as fast as you can. Well, Tevish and Crom give you a little bit more of a grindability factor, but there's only been 6 games submitted with Tevish Crom, which isn't a whole lot, right? That's not very many at all.
no.
So it's really a question of, like, who is submitting and how plugged in are they?
And the other thing is like, one of the things that people don't kind of take into account is what the hotness is with brewing. Like you said, that lag is there's a delay into the trice, the non, like the trice meta will pick it up, and like that's where a lot of that testing happens, like that real cutting edge testing, and then it'll kind of matriculate into the proxy metas, webcam metas that tend to be a little bit slower to adapt things because you physically have to put it together. So people are always less hesitant to switch decks when they have to, like, spend effort changing things. And then it'll kind of switch, and then it'll kind of matriculate out off of the online, then it'll go offline to, like, local play groups and LGSs at, you know, that are meeting in person and playing offline with paper cards, kind of as like that. And then that cycle will repeat.
And there's kind of an effect where there's oftentimes a coalescence around expertise is what I'm going to call this. But basically, a lot of the decks that get submitted are decks that are represented on the main deck list database page, right? So, like, Tevish Crom and Armix Crom are both on the Brewer's Corner part of the DB.
For now,
they're both there. They're decks that have been recognized by the reviewers and the managers as being pretty decent decks that they want to see some more out of before putting them up to the main list, but they have the potential. But a lot of people, they see the DB as this source of information that they want, and they take it as really a solid thing that is monolithic, and it's really not intended to be that, right? If you talk to any of the DB managers or any of the DB reviewers, we'll all say the database is a very useful resource. It's got information that can be helpful. It is not designed to be anything beyond a resource that you can use. It's not designed to be, it's not designed to be like the definition of what the cEDH meta is.
No.
So it's one of those things where, you know, a player who's not necessarily plugged in as much to what's going on, if you search for cEDH on Google, the first thing that comes up, I think, is the deck list database. Yeah, it's the first thing when you Google it. So if you want to build a cEDH deck, you click there. You don't see that it's got the drop downs. You just look at the decks there on the main page. You pick one, and that's what you stick with.
Right. Well, and also those are probably the decks you've heard about and, like, stuff like that. Like, where, like, well, like, stuff like Tevish Crom are good. They're really good. And they are getting screen time with content creators. they don't have like the large library of games aggregated online as say like Kess or Timnacrom.
And there's not as much of the
Thracias.
shill factor, if we're being honest. Like a lot of the decks that are on the DB are established and or have people who will very heavily go to bat for those decks. I mean, look at Clark Sakashima, the Siskel and Ebert deck. Like, is it necessarily the best deck in cEDH? No, but it's completely viable. And Ken goes to bat for that deck. I mean, how many people, when looking at MH2 spoilers, have been like, oh man, I bet at Stacked cEDH is really excited about this for Clark Sakashima.
Yep.
It's become his calling card. And when you have decks like that, they really, people plug into it.
Every Squirrel card that got posted so far, I've at least gotten 2 DMs about. I mean, I'm excited for Squirrel Storm, but I can't find a spot for it.
Well, I think about like Paco and Halden when like there was a period of time where it was something that people were talking about a lot, and that was largely on the back of Braden from cEDH Cast talking it up.
Which does really well in a budget meta, by the way.
I bet.
Oh, it's like a
green and blue? Who knew?
Well, so the meta is a lot slower because, you know, all your ramp and everything's just like, not only is it more dirtily, but like there's just, it just like flips all your cards and you're just like, oh.
I mean, if we're talking about combat damage being relevant, Paco goes hard in the paint.
It does. It does. So, all right. Well, I think that pretty much goes over the I don't know why I'm drawing a blank here, but over the metagame for project. Yep, the update for May. So Cricket, where can people find you?
I can be found on the Grixis Mean Girls Discord server. We've just recently updated it, so it's got a new server icon and a really nice invite link, so be sure to check that out. And then, of course, I'm also a budget helper and admin over on the cEDH Budget Brews Discord.
And James, where can people find you, Mr. Squirrelmob?
You can find me all over the internet. I'm a moderator on the cEDH subreddit. I am a decklist reviewer on the database subreddit. I am involved in cEDH Nexus. And, of course, I run the Metagame project. So you can find me most of those places as Squirrelmob. I'm a little bit different on Twitter, at Hoff Occultist on Twitter. I know it causes Timmy to go insane here. And you can find the Metagame project at bit.ly/cEDH Meta 3.
It'll be in the show notes too. Yep. Well, as you all know, I'm Timmy T1000 on the interwebs. You can find me on pretty much everywhere. And I'm Timmy T1000 pretty much everywhere. And if you like what you saw here and you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/cEDH_budget_brews. Give us a buck. It'll help improve everybody's equipment and keep the lights on. And please hit that like, share, and subscribe. So everybody have a good night.